Hello, class, and welcome to Chapter 1. There's a misconception about economics that it's the dismal science. That got its name because Thomas Malthus, an economist, looked at the rising population and the limited food supply, and he based his projection upon this axiom that population will increase geometrically while food supply increases arithmetically. He then surmised that we would outpace our own food supply and scarce resources, and at about the point where we hit 1 billion world population, we would then starve to death, have wars, and fall back into the dark ages. This dire prediction, which of course did not turn true, was based upon false ideas. We actually have 7.8 billion people on the earth. That's almost 8 times as many people at the time Thomas Malthus made his projections, and the standard of living for the average person on earth is much, much better than it was 220 years ago. So what was it that Malthus missed? Well, he didn't account for human innovation. He didn't account for capitalism. He didn't account for the change in the way that we would do things when based on when hitting limits. So if you don't have a limit, then behavior will be more chaotic, but with running up against the limits of space, arable land, water, and so forth. When the problem actually comes upon us, we innovate and come up with technologies to overcome it. Actually, I should say innovations, because the technology to overcome many of these problems already exist, but because they're very expensive to implement those technologies, we usually don't. For instance, the idea of alternative fuels or different types of energy, ways to make electricity exist, but right now they're very, very expensive compared to fossil fuels and the cheap ways that we make electricity right now. There's also the issue of, let's say, the nuclear energy. Atomic energy is something that we have the technology for, but we won't use it because of political blocking. So there's and you may or may not agree with any of these statements, and you're welcome to do so. But the idea with Malthus is he looked at the time, let's say around 1800, that the world was going to have a 1 billion population, and he could easily see that in 50 or 100 years later that we'd be up to considerably higher population worldwide. And then he figured that it would take off. And those parts of the projection were more or less correct, although that back in this point we were expecting a higher, and with those, I shouldn't say we, there's projections that say, for instance, at the high end, that by the close of this century that we'll have over 15 billion people on Earth. There's other projections which say that actually our population is going to drop from where it is right now, and both of these assumptions are wrong. Both of these assumptions are are wrong because they're based on projections that are 80 years long, and so the projection of what our population is going to be next year is probably a pretty good estimation, a pretty good projection. But even here we have a major discrepancy 50 years from now in the year 2060 or 2070, and it's going to be even less likely that either of those extremes are going to be the population. So what's this have to do with our course? Well, for one thing, it's not a dismal science at all. Another is that projections are false, but they're based upon assumptions and models, and so they have some truth to them, and short-range projections are usually more accurate than long-range projections. Plus, I'm encouraging you to think in terms of graphics and trade-offs and conflict and various ideas that I'd like you to be skeptical of things rather than just accept them, and to challenge them and to see what kind of assumptions are being used in various projections. The if you have these tools, these economic tools to make better decisions, then you'll understand how the world works and you'll be better at making your own projections. You'll also be a more informed citizen and have a better life because you'll be making better decisions. In addition, this course, I'm going to give you some financial literacy, show you how to be a millionaire and so forth, and understand Social Security and healthcare, among other things. The big questions that we're addressing in this PowerPoint slide are these two. What is economics, and what are the 5 foundations of economics? Now, economics is about scarcity and making choices. So when we think about our choices, we only can choose between various competing wants. We can't really actually choose what we need or not. So you might say that economists understand that choices are limited or bounded rationality, but the limited nature of society's resources means that people have to make some choices. And economics is the study of how people make those decisions. And those people that we're talking about include households and firms and governments. Now remember, folks, that governments don't make decisions. People within government make decisions. And corporations don't make decisions. It's people within those corporations that make decisions. And the same thing with households. But in a broad sense for macroeconomics, think about those 3 players of households, firms, and governments and how they interact. Also, when we study an economic system, we're interested in what is being produced, how they're producing it, and who gets the production that they make. Those 3 essential questions. Let's differentiate between microeconomics, which is concerned with individual decisions. Even a large company making a single decision is still microeconomics. And macroeconomics, which is an aggregate or collection of all those different decisions put together for an economy. You can study the macroeconomics of a continent or of a region or of a country or of a time period. I'd like to give you this graphic of the United States flag. This flag is made up of many different little photographs, you might say microeconomic decisions that are being made that create an entire picture. So the macroeconomy is kind of like the big picture made up of a bunch of little mosaic of little microeconomic pictures. Macroeconomics is a study of the broader economy, such as inflation, economic growth and productivity, unemployment, interest rates, and something called aggregate demand and aggregate supply, as opposed to individual demand. We have aggregate demand, which is the demand for all things at a particular time. Also, aggregate supply is also a collection of all those things that are able to be supplied, the total production, you might say, of a country. If you've ever seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off, you'll recognize Ben Stein here. And he made economics sound so boring in the class. I hope that you'll find at least this course a little more exciting than that. In fact, the movie Ferris Bueller has lots of demonstrations of what I call the 5 foundations of economics. The incentives that came into play, life, and all of the different things that you are trying to make it, all your various options that you're considering have trade-offs. There's no such thing as a perfect solution. There's always trade-offs inherent in any option. Then we want to show a difference between trade-offs and opportunity costs, as well as thinking on the margin, which is a key economic tool. Finally, a foundation of economics is that trade creates value. We'll get to each one of these in turn. Okay, so first of all, when we think about incentives, we think about perhaps the carrot and the stick. We think about positive incentives and negative incentives. So not to be confused with what they mean by positive and negative in psychology, economics uses these terms of positive economics to mean like being enticed or offered some reward, and negative incentives are being threatened or punished. So you can imagine, for instance, that there's positive incentives that come into play in your life, and it would be helpful if you considered what kind of boss you'd like to be. Do you want to motivate your workers with bonuses and pats on the back and reward, or do you want to motivate them by threats and punishment and penalties and so forth? Probably it's a good manager is able to use both, and is able also to create a management environment where their preferred or methods are being used. The slide here talks about incentives in a general way, that they're factors that motivate you to act. And positive incentives, for instance, on a macroeconomic level, would be tax refunds or employee of the month at your business, extra credit in a course. Negative incentives would be the taxes that might be imposed, some kind of jail or fines, spankings, and so forth. I'd like you to consider this idea of the carrot and the stick. This is an old idea about how to motivate an animal to move down the road. You can offer it a carrot, and it'll move towards the carrot as a positive incentive, and you'll get it to move in the direction you want it to move by offering it a positive incentive. Or you can threaten it with a stick and offer once the animal figures out that the stick will cause pain, if it doesn't do what you want, then it'll move away from the stick, and you either use the carrot or the stick to move an animal. Now, ask yourself about how does the government that you live in, how do they approach these problems? Do they mainly use positive incentives to try to change behavior, or do they use negative incentives? And then, therefore, the more that we use, especially carrots and sticks, the more you can recognize how the people that are trying to manage us think of us. There's also direct and indirect incentives. They give you a good example here. For instance, if you offer straight A's, you offer your child $500 if they get straight A's, then what you're saying is that if they do this, get this result, then they'll get $500. So $500 is a direct incentive for getting straight A's. But an indirect incentive is that the child is now indirectly incentivized to get A's, perhaps by any means necessary, or they might choose not to do other things that also have value, like extracurricular activities, because they're focused so much on the one thing, that is getting straight A's. One of my favorite topics in macroeconomics is unintended consequences. These are the predictable results of a badly written policy that nevertheless are not intended as the stated purpose of the policy. So an unintended consequence, as they wrote it, is an unplanned result. And generally speaking, they're unintended. We're going to come back to this many, many times. So learn this unintended consequence idea. So the one of my favorites that I'll talk about later is that when Congress placed a tariff on heavy vehicles being imported into the country, that it created an unintended consequence of Germany and Japan developing very lightweight, fuel-efficient vehicles that they otherwise would not have been advanced into technology, and the American car companies did not put forth that kind of effort into building technology because they were protected from foreign competition by the tariff. So the immediate and intended purpose of the tariff was to get to provide higher amounts of profits and job protection for auto workers in the U.S. And in so doing, Congress laid the groundwork for the foreign competition in automobiles to supersede the United States. They actually had the long run effect of destroying the automotive industry in America, or crippling it. Let's say destroying might be a little strong. So here in the example that the authors give you is a social safety net. So most agree, for instance, that we should have some sort of help for people that are unlucky. They're disabled or maybe they're unemployed, or they're just going through a rough patch or something like that. So what happens if the money from the safety net is higher than the amount that the person would receive if they got a job? Let's say that they receive it because they don't have a job. But if they don't, for every week that goes by that they don't get a job, then they get paid more than if they are successful in landing a job. What's the incentive structure for that? And you might say that if you wanted to imagine it yourself, you're a low-skilled worker out of work, you could either get a full-time low-wage job and get $400 a week, or you could remain on welfare and get $450 per week. So you say, well, which one would you do? And the reason why I ask it as you is because the answers will vary, right? Some people who are who think long term might decide to choose number one for various reasons, and other people who are just looking at, I can either, well, they might say this, that option 2 is better for them. They'll remain on welfare one more week and they'll collect $450 and they won't have to work. In fact, what some people do, and that was especially true of this some recent history, if those who were unemployed received a check, then those that wanted to get the check and get paid would then work under the table, but officially declare themselves as unemployed. So it takes all stripes, and of course that's an unintended consequence as well. So what's one way to solve this problem? If you're offering, if you think the $450 welfare payment is the right amount, but $400 is the best that they can do because they're low skilled, then how can you correct that situation? And there's a number of different possibilities. What you might consider is that the program itself is badly designed, and that you could improve the design of the program to remove this particular unintended consequence. So you would understand that people are incentivized to decide what they're going to do on a micro level, and that's going to affect things like unemployment, their training level, and so forth. So one of my favorite ways to address this particular problem is to offer an earned income tax credit. We'll talk more about that when we get to fiscal policy, but essentially what happens with the earned income tax credit, it's something that we already have in our system, that people who are working but not earning very much will get additional dollars from the federal government because they're working and not earning very much. So, for instance, if you were, let's say you had a job that paid $11 an hour, and you work 1,000 hours this year, well, you make $11,000. The federal government would give you another $8,000 because you did that. If you stayed at home, you wouldn't get that $8,000 from the federal government in the earned income tax credit piece. So it's a way to make up a difference here. If we wanted to go back to this particular example, we could make something similar that was, say, if you fixed it so that remaining on welfare you got less than $400, or if you wanted to use the earned income tax credit, you would be able to, you'd get $400 from your employer, but maybe you'd get $100 from the federal government. So by going to work, you'd get $500. By not going to work, you'd get $450, and that would be an incentive structure change. Patents and copyrights. There's incentives for innovation because it's expensive to develop, let's say, pharmaceuticals, and if you knew that if you came up with something that could be stolen, your rights to your invention are being protected through the patent and copyright. Same thing with authorship of books and so forth. Now, second principle of economics, or fundamental of economics, is about trade-offs. See, when you have scarcity, you got to make decisions, and whatever decision you're making has some unfortunate pieces to it. You've got to break some eggs if you're going to bake a cake. You're going to have a downside to any sort of piece. Like, for instance, if you decide to go to a party tonight, then the trade-off about that is you're going to get less sleep, and it also means that you may have to you'll have your picture taken while you're there, probably. So it just goes with the territory. And um, what happens is the um, government faces trade-offs as well. They have, for instance, this idea of both opportunity cost and of let's say if we penalize polluting companies would be a good one to consider. So if we were to penalize polluting companies, you get the advantage of cleaner air because we would expect the companies would change something. They would respond to that negative incentive. Penalizing is a negative incentive, and so we would get some better health. But we would also expect those companies, some of those companies would close because they wouldn't be able to cost effectively avoid polluting. Some of them would leave the country or leave the state wherever the policy is being enforced, and they would go someplace else so that we'd actually still have pollution in the world. It would just be created in another place by people that are employed somewhere else. So you've got a trade-off, if you will, with each of those things. All right. Opportunity cost is the value placed on the next best alternative. So how much value you place on sleep, if that was what you should be doing, if that's you're watching this video right now, but whatever you would have done otherwise is your next best alternative, and the value you place on that thing that you're sacrificing is your opportunity cost. And the cost of something is what you give up to get it in economics. So because of scarcity, you have to make choices, and because you have to make choices, every choice has an opportunity cost because you're choosing not to do your second best option with whatever resources. Usually opportunity cost is in terms of time, and so we give you an example of, let's say, if you went to the mall or the pool. If you went to the cost of going to the mall is that you don't go to the pool, and so your opportunity cost is not going to the pool. The opportunity cost of going to the pool is not going to the mall, and so to minimize your opportunity cost, you select the option that has the largest benefit. So you want to, think of it this way, that if you go to the pool, then it doesn't mean you didn't want to go to the mall. And if you go to the mall, it didn't mean that you didn't value the pool, but you chose the one that had the highest amount. Or since you only have a couple hours to spend and you can do it either way, whichever one you do should be the one that gives you the largest benefit. And in fact, that's how that works when people they make their decision based upon what they believe will give them the greatest benefit. So in the case of a business, the business realizes that, for instance, we'll come back to pharmaceuticals, they can hire their best salesperson and have them work in Albany, or they could have and that person would maybe make $3 million for their company. So that's obviously a very good idea. Have your best salesperson in Albany, you'll make $3 million. But the way that a business decision would say is they're like, because we have our best salesperson in Albany, then that means they're not anyplace else. So where would we have put our best salesperson if not in Albany? And you say, okay, well, really the best place for our best salesperson to be is in Washington, D.C. And if we put our best salesperson in Washington, D.C., we'll make $30 million this year, so extra. So it actually costs us $30 million to put our best salesperson in Albany, because our opportunity cost that we miss is $30 million. This is where it comes to thinking on the margin. The margin is how much more would we make by putting them in Washington, D.C.? We'd make an extra $27 million. That's the economic way of thinking on the margin. It's a systemic way of evaluating your top two choices. You want both these things. Which one is going to be, what's the marginal cost related to choice 1 over choice 2? What's the marginal benefit of choice 1 over choice 2? And then you can, thinking on the margin, consider a way that you could be a little better off. Marginal thinking, often I'd like to talk about food. So, if you haven't had any pizza yet, you wanted some pizza, the amount of benefit from the first slice of pizza is really big. the next slice of pizza that you eat is not as good. I mean, it's good, but it's not as satisfying as the first slice of pizza. But you might still eat a third slice of pizza because you perceive that there's still some benefit there. But if you look around and you're like, oh man, there's a salad there, there's some wings, instead of having that third slice of pizza, which is beneficial, you like pizza, that's why you went for it first. You go for maybe the salad or the wings because they're going to be more beneficial than the third slice of pizza. I love these examples they give about real life things. So you got a friend, they're coming over. You didn't know they were coming over. They just said, "Hey, I'm in your neighborhood. I'll be there in 10 minutes." So you got 10 minutes to clean up. So what you do is you quickly assess what needs to be done to make your place look a little bit better, and you get the main things, the things that will be most beneficial out of the way, out of sight, clean up. You're probably not going to grab the vacuum cleaner and start cleaning the dust bunnies underneath your couch when you only have 10 minutes to do. You will definitely throw the dirty dishes into the sink. You'll get the whatever, get the clothes off the couch, something like that. So you will if you understand the scenario, and you've been in that kind of scenario, you can easily see that you're going to do those things that have the highest benefit compared to other things that are also beneficial with the least amount of cost compared to other things that also have a cost to them. And remember, the cost in this case is the amount of time that you're doing. So the cost-benefit analysis at the margin for vacuuming is that if I move the furniture, I'm going to have very small marginal benefit at a great marginal cost. So I probably will not move the furniture. And that plays out, right? When I vacuum, I sometimes, but rarely, will move the furniture to do so. This is one about let's get into college and thinking about economic decisions there. So is going to college worth it? So sometimes we hear phrases like this: college graduates earn $1 million more in their lifetimes than high school grads, which is true, but you should challenge that. Look at that skeptically. Do college graduates earn $1 million more in their lifetimes than high school grads? You say, well, that must be an average, right? On average, college graduates earn a greater amount of lifetime earnings than those who only have a high school graduation. Okay, that's probably true, but certainly not true in every case. But that's okay. We're interested in overall trends. And then we might say, what is the reason for that? And the obvious correlation of college graduates also earning more over their lifetime implies that it's college that caused the higher amount of earnings. This is where I want you to be skeptical. Is it possible that these people who are earning more would have earned more than high school grads anyway? Is there something that's common to people who are successful in graduating college that also link up to having higher earnings? And is there something about people who don't graduate from college that also associate with lower earnings? Things like disability, low achievement, difficulty in holding down, completing work, all sorts of maybe hostility towards other people, stuff like that. And you say, oh yeah, okay. So if we have, if there may be some things that are true of college graduates, right? If you graduate from college, it means that you've been able to finish what you started. It means that you're older. It means that you're have been able to get along, and perform satisfactorily, at least under a number of different people, all sorts of different management styles, and you've been able to navigate some complicated pieces there. So having all those skills are in fact also heavily correlated with higher earnings. So you hear politicians say that everyone should go to college, but you should definitely be skeptical about that. Everyone should not go to college. college will benefit everyone? No. And not only that, it's especially when you're putting in the average, right? Some people are studying things in college that don't have any, let's say, marketability. So that we would anticipate that and that a person who majors in a particularly you know a major that may be interesting to learn about, but doesn't have any kind of demand in the marketplace, that person, when they graduate from college, will not be able to get a higher paying job because they haven't learned any skills or useful information that someone would pay them more for. So you want to choose those majors carefully. We expect all our nation's children to go to college is something that you hear politicians say, and that it's the fact that politicians are saying it. You should be skeptical of that. The I've got a little statistic here that I think you might be interested in regarding a recent Forbes 500 article about the 500 richest billionaires in the world, and they by their college majors. And it turns out that turns out that studying economics is pretty good. You guys ever hear the what do I got here? I had to do a little Travis McCoy and Bruno Mars song about billionaire, but it turns out that there's economics is the major related with more billionaires than any other major. So the next number 2 is business administration, and we have out of the top 500 billionaires in the world, 46 of them are economists. So only 42 of them were business administration. Now you might know that electrical engineers make a lot of money, get right out of college, and their lifetime earnings, the average lifetime earnings for an electrical engineer is in fact 3.2 billion, and 3.5 million. Also, economists on average make same amount, 3.5 million in their lifetime. So that's the average economic. Those are the top 2 majors for lifetime earnings and for frequency of billionaires. Okay, we can look at. I have some videos that help you weigh out other things too. But let's take a look at this graphic, because we love economics for laughs and graphs. And here we have a person's age, 18 years old. 4 years later, they're 22, and so forth. And what happens if when they graduate from high school, if they start working? Well, what happens to their yearly earnings? That's right. So they get a job and they get a raise and they're working more and they're making more and more each year. And so if all things go well, the average person coming out of school is making money that way. What happens if you go to school? Well, instead of making money, you're actually paying money and not making it. So you've got 2 things going on here for those 4 years. You're losing money in terms of paying for college, and you're missing out on all these earnings that your classmates were earning there. So your cost of going to college for those 4 years is pretty tremendous, but then the amount that you make afterwards is a higher amount. Even if it's not initially, it might not make more, but you're definitely going to have an annual amounts that you would expect to be above the average person who went to high school. And so to label those things, we'd say that A is the earnings for the college grad, and the B is the earnings for the high school grad. That Y is the opportunity cost of going to college, and X is the cost of going to college in terms of outlay of finances, and Z is the marginal benefit of your earnings each year over what you would have made as a high school grad every year for some length of years. And we'd figure that if your working life's going to be 40 years, something like that, from 22 to 62. You might go longer than that, but so we're talking about like a 40-year spread here between that. And then that's how they label it: college and high school. And then they give you ideas about how to think about X. That's the direct cost of college. Opportunity cost. The college premium, that is the extra money earned, is Z. And if you wanted to think about it mathematically, which we love to do, that if Z is greater than X plus Y, right, then you go to college. If the marginal benefits, that is Z, is greater than the marginal cost. I would add a complexity to this model as well. It's a good idea. I mean, it simplifies it, and that's fine. But I would also say that there's a time value of money, right? So $1,000 spent here is worth more than $1,000 earned when you're 62. But if it was said, am I willing to spend $10,000 now to make $100,000 later? And then you see the idea about the time interest of money. Okay. So it's a difficult question about this, really. Lots of examples of people that make a very decent living and have a good life. They didn't go to college. But I think that folks that have a idea, they have a lot of entrepreneurial abilities. They've got a talent. They should pursue that and probably take some classes on the side as well. Don't wait till you're out of school to start your business. It takes years to get the business off the ground, and you can be going to college and getting the business off the ground probably at the same time. At least it's worth considering. Okay. So the question really is the marginal benefit of going to school greater than the marginal cost of going to college? And that's the right way to think about it. Everyone will come up with a different answer based upon their own prospects, abilities, interests, fields, and so forth. But the economic way of thinking about the question is the correct way to think about the question, to frame it correctly. And that's what this marginal thinking is about. Okay. Some other ideas to consider when you are going to college, right? The sense of accomplishment, the long-term benefits, the 97% of unemployment is more common in jobs that are not college jobs. So there's exceptions to that. I recommend you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They have some very, very useful information. We have an assignment about that coming up too, a discussion board. Fifthly, the fundamental concepts are trade creates value. So a market is anywhere where there's buyers and sellers, and trade is when there's voluntary, and this is key, trade and markets have to do with voluntary exchange. So the buyer and the seller agree to make an exchange, and that means they're better off. I give you something that I have more of than I need, I'm giving up something I want to you in exchange for something that I want more. And you're giving up something that you want, but you don't need, and you're giving it to me in exchange for something that I'm giving you that you want more than what you're giving me. And because you want it more and I want it more, then we have made a beneficial trade where I value what I get from you more than what I value I gave to you. And you value more what you got from me than what you gave to me. So there's, in fact, more value because we traded. That's a fundamental idea, and that's why we want to have as much voluntary behavior. We want to have markets be as free as possible to allow individuals to voluntarily make exchanges, and especially they want to have choices, right? So if there were a bunch of people selling and a bunch of people buying, then that's where you have a more free market, more competition, then it's going to lead to a higher amount of efficiency in the markets, because People won't overpay for things because they know they can get it somewhere else for cheaper unless they can. And if they can't get it, if they can't get what they're looking for less, then they're happy with the price because they've shopped around. That's key, absolutely key about voluntary nature. We're going to talk about comparative advantage in another talk. But comparative advantage is comparing the opportunity cost of different producers. And that's why if I'm really good at making sandwiches, let's say, and you're really good at making pants, then instead of, even though we both need pants and sandwiches, you'll specialize in what you're good at, make more than you need, and sell some of them to me in exchange for what I make. So if I'm making sandwiches and you're making pants, I'll make some extra sandwiches for you and you make an extra pants for me. And that's how you specialize and then trade. Now, there are some trade controversies, as they say, but and the issue has to be if you allow for competition and the freedom and voluntary action among different players, then some people who don't want to compete because competition is hard find that they don't get paid as much as they'd like to. They have to work very hard every day, and someone else might come in, step in, and on their territory. And those things are actually desirable in a world market. I think the real controversy might be is if the trade's only happening one direction. But we'll talk about the world economy in another talk as well. Now, economics bases their decision. I told you that economics is the science of decisions, and because it's the science of decisions, we use the scientific method. Economics is different from perhaps, let's say, psychology, because it assumes that people are actually able to make decisions. So you couldn't have the science of decisions unless there were decisions. And you can't have decisions unless you have free will. And you can't have free will unless, right, that people have the ability to be rational. And you can't prove that people are rational, so you assume it. Now, as it turns out, all the sciences make assumptions of one sort or another. What about physics? Yep, physics assumes that what we perceive is real. They and if you understand what we're saying there, then we're saying that all sciences start with some basic assumptions. For instance, that the universe is knowable would be another assumption. And economics is different from other sciences in that we move into this idea of assuming rationality. Now, rationality doesn't mean fully rational, but it does mean that they're capable of making a choice. This is a very low bar for rationality. We just need to have people have a choice and they're able to choose one or the other. If that's the situation, then they're rational. What we'll do is when we explain what a person does in economics, we'll use the rationality assumption and say that we'll assume that they chose A over B because of their perceived costs and perceived benefits. That is to say, their marginal costs were lower and their marginal benefits were higher, some combination of that, when they chose A over B. That's why people do what they do. Now, this is an extremely important slide. Ding, ding, bing, bang, bang. Look at this. Whenever I ask, why does someone do what they do? Whenever you're wondering what someone is going to do, whenever some policy is passed, or your boss does something, or your family member does something, you can, if you want to, say that they're just crazy, or that that's the way they are, and that they weren't using their rationality. Or you can be an economist and say, all right, they did what they did because they thought about their next best choice, and they decided to do what they did because their perceived cost. And the reason I say perceived is because it may turn out that it's more costly than they thought or not as beneficial as they thought. But at the time they made their action or their decision, they were basing it on their marginal perceived costs and benefits. All right, that's my 5-minute warning, so I'm going to bring it home. An effective way to find out about things that are observable and repeatable is the scientific method. This is just a review. I'm sure you've seen the scientific method ever since you were in grammar school, but you may not have thought about science as having limits. There's a lot in today's society that says society is, or that science is unlimited, but of course it is limited. So I'm going to give you some of these, and you tell me whether science can answer this question or not. Right? Cell structure, yes. Human behavior. Much of human behavior can be analyzed using the scientific method. Yes. Whether or not your dog responds to cheese. Absolutely. Gravity, planetary motion. Yep, science, very useful for those things. Yep. What a dinosaur was thinking. No, we cannot use science for that. Brainwaves. Yeah, we can use science for that. The U.S. presidential election of 1896. No, we can't use science for that. You may ask, why do I say that you can't? It's certainly an event. Well, remember, science is useful for only those things that are observable and repeatable. So even though the U.S. presidential election of 1896 did occur, it's a historical event. So we don't use science to find out about it. We use other methods to find out about that, but not science, because it's not observable or repeatable. You might say it was observable at the time, but now we rely on documents, evidence, historical evidence, testimony, and so forth. You see, that's not science, but it's still a way of getting at truth. So what I'd like you to consider is that science, I'm a scientist, I love science, economics is the science of decisions, but there's certain things that science can't prove or disprove because it's got its limits, because science is just a method, a strategy, if you will. It's a way of getting at certain kinds of truth that are repeatable and observable. How about the reign of XVZ-TRLX? We're not even sure what that is, but we're very sure that we can't use science to study it. Free will. Funny thing about free will, you can't use science for that either, because since it's outside of the physical universe, right? It can't be studied using science. We only can kind of get at it by assuming it. And this is where your decision piece, it's the difference between whether you are a brain and just limited to as a machine. Are you just a bunch of protons and neutrons and electrons, or are you something more than that, something capable of agency? Do you have a brain? If you have a brain, then you have free will. If you are a brain, you don't have free will. So my students fall into three categories. There's those that accept the idea that we do have free will, and they proceed. There's those that are skeptical, and they're willing to proceed as though we have free will, and they're going to proceed. And then there's those that are sure that we don't have free will, and really they should just quit. Because I have nothing for them. Because if you don't have free will, then you can't make a choice. And if you can't make a choice, then there is no economics. Does that make sense? I hope so. So the catch about that is that if a person doesn't believe they have free will, then they also don't have the freedom to quit the class or to take the class. Actually, they have no choice what they do. They're not even, well, you get me. It's a problem. If you don't have free will, you're beyond my help. Okay. So what is the scientific method? Well, it starts with observation, and then you remember that. I think that's important, right? You keep your eyes open. You try to explain what you're seeing with a hypothesis, And then you build a model that would say, well, if my hypothesis is true, then there's this relationship between this thing and the other thing that's going to be true. So the hypothesis is often, you often jump right through these very fast once you start doing this, but you see something first, you try to explain it, and then you say, if my explanation is true, then I can have a model or a relationship between X and Y. Then I can test that experiment by seeing if there's other examples of this thing that I'm looking at. And then as you gather the data, you can then analyze the data to see whether whether your model is holding up to the data. You usually have to refine the model. You have to change your hypothesis and make it shorter, more succinct, more limited, alter it. Sometimes you can expand it, sometimes you reject it, but in so doing, you're using the scientific method. It's graphically represented here, where you make observations and think about interesting questions, formulate a hypothesis, and develop some kind of testable prediction, what I called forming a model, and so does your book, so that's why I called it that. Once you gather the data from and your test predictions, then you can either refine or alter, expand, or reject the hypothesis. You might even expand into some general theory and make more further observations, which lead into deeper and more expansive science. So, was the collapse of the Soviet Union inevitable, is one of our questions. What caused so many prisoners to die in those ships in that video that I had you watch for the discussion board this week? What economic benefit do smokers provide to non-smokers? That's a question that we can evaluate in this class. And these questions that you're asking in the discussion board are ones that you're interested in. These are kind of questions that I might ask. And why is a mandate for more generous maternity leave benefits detrimental to young women? How is it that a mandate that, if a government tells employers that they have to pay more generous maternity leave benefits, why would that possibly be detrimental to young women? And those questions and the unintended consequences of, you might say, well-intended policies are what we're looking at. So now, decisions require two things: options that you're aware of and free will. And I gave you these in the piece. When you ask a good economic question, it's got like an alternative built into the question. Is it better to repair the car or save the money to buy our next car? That's a good economic question. And it's ineffective to ask, should we repair the car, because you're not comparing it to anything. So it's not really an economic question. And certainly, do you love your car? Do you? That's not an economic question at all. It's about feeling. I mean, feelings are important, but I don't want our discussions to be about feelings. I want our discussions to be about facts. I want our discussions to be about evidence. I want our discussions to rely on science and these fundamentals. You'll score points by mentioning these 5 fundamental economics pieces, one or more of them in any discussion board that you have. Okay. So, in conclusion, economics is the science of decisions. Economists ask and answer some big questions, and I'm helping you to understand not just your own decisions, but the entire economy here in macroeconomics. And I give you those 5 key principles. Economics is the study of how people allocate their limited resources to satisfy nearly unlimited wants. And those 5 foundations of economics, once again, are these 5 here. Let's do a few questions before we wrap up. All right? So, actually, I'm going to refer you to those. So I'll do the first one, but there's several of them. If you go to this PowerPoint presentation in Blackboard, you will find these questions at the end of each of the PowerPoints. And some of them are repeated in the concept exams, or versions of them when you take the concept exam. So they're always worth doing. The way that you work these questions is you look at the question, you look at the answers, and you decide which one is the correct choice. Go ahead and do so now. Did you answer A, scarcity forces us to make choices? Then you got it right. If you didn't, go back and look at these materials again. good luck to you, everybody, and we're going to schedule more of these if there's still demand for them. I'll keep supplying them. Take care, economists. Until next time.